So let's talk about some factors in persuasive communication. So one of the factors, obviously, there's a few. There's audience, there's source credibility, there's appealing to self-interest, there's clarity of message, timing and context, audience participation, suggestions for action, content, and content and structure of messages. So let's start off with audience analysis. When you're analyzing your audience for the sake of a persuasive speech or any type of persuasive messaging, knowing your audience, as I've said to you guys numerous times before, is super important. So you can mine data from the census, and the census defines audiences in terms of their age, their gender, their income, but also you need to get data on your audience using psychographics. And that's knowledge about an audience's beliefs, attitudes, concerns, their lifestyle. The book talks about the values and lifestyle program that's used to help communicators make persuasive messages for different types of people. And it's more effective when persuasive messaging is more effective when personal characteristics are taken into account. And again, those are, knowledge about the audience's beliefs, attitudes, concerns, and their lifestyle. The next factor we'll talk about is source credibility. Source credibility is determined based on expertise, sincerity, and charisma. One of the things that I tell, those three things are really what I talk about the most to my 1402 students. Obviously, expertise is really important, right? The audience's perception of you is largely based on how much of an expert they think you are on this particular subject. But more in line with what we talked about appealing to people on an emotional level, is these two concepts of sincerity and charisma. And so sincerity, you're more likely to be believed by your audience if they believe that you're sincere. And charisma is really about projecting an image of competence, projecting an image of leadership, and also about your energy and how charismatic people think you are about that topic. Next, we're talking about appealing to self-interest. People's self-interest is really made up of their self-esteem and their sense of belonging. And so people are likely to respond to messages that boost their ego, boost their gratification, messages that give them an opportunity to make a contribution towards society, especially where it comes to promoting their sense of belonging, and also responding to messages that make them think that they're going to get recognition from their peers. Now let's talk about clarity of your messaging. We'll start with complexity. Messages complex in content or language fail to persuade a large part of the crowd. And most complex messages in general fail to persuade people. So it's all about simplicity. It's all about direct and simple messages because those are more readily accepted by the public. Simple messaging, when we talk about simple messaging, we talk about messaging that articulates one primary idea. All right, so next we're going to talk about timing and context. When we deal with public relations as a process, it's usually geared towards a particular issue, a particular campaign, an objective, an overall objective. And so when we're working with the media, we have to remember that one of the main principles of journalism has to do with this sense of timeliness. So when we're advocating regarding any type of issue, it has to be something that's current. It has to be something that is timely because people respond to things that are relevant. And so we talk about providing immediate solutions to immediate problems. We talk about right timing resulting in supportive responses. And so it's very simple. when we are doing any type of public relations activity, particularly when it comes to persuasive communication, it has to be timely and it has to be relevant, meaning it has to matter to your audience. So next we're going to talk about audience participation. And so when we involve our audience in crafting persuasive messaging, two things can happen. We're talking about changing an attitude and reinforcement of beliefs. And so audience participation really benefits the creator of the perspective because you're involving your audience. It also helps to foster this sense of belonging and help actualize your audience's beliefs. So that's what we talk about when we talk about reinforcing beliefs. All right, guys, so moving on, we are now going to talk about suggestions for action. And so when we talk about persuasive communication, we talk about this sponsor-dependent principle. And so what that means is that people endorse ideas only if the sponsor proposes an action. So in plain terms, that just means that you can't just tell people to do something. You also need to provide them with the how and why. You should describe all possible outcomes and also be clear. All right, so next we're going to talk about content and structure of messages. And so when we talk about structure and content, we're talking about using various techniques. And so the ones that the book talks about are drama, statistics, endorsements, and emotional appeal. We covered some of those a little bit earlier in this chapter, but let's go over a few of them again. And so the first technique that the book talks about is drama, because everybody likes a good story, right? So I actually really discovered how important drama is in persuasive writing back when I was writing my personal statement for my graduate program. I started out writing a really great essay, and I showed it to a mentor of mine and said, hey, could you take a look at this? Tell me what you think. And so his feedback to me was really simple. It was just, hey, where's the Disney? And so I really wasn't sure what he was talking about. And, you know, when he actually clarified it for me, what he explained to me was that I wasn't just writing some random essay on a topic. I was actually selling myself. I was persuading the graduate school to allow me admission for my studies. And I took that feedback and I went back to the table and I thought about how drama is so effective in persuading people. And I decided to fill my essay with stories about my life and mentorship and what I want to do in the future and all of this grand vision. And so what ended up happening was I created a fantastic essay. I ended up getting into grad school, but more importantly, I learned that no persuasive communication is ever complete without a good dose of drama. And so the second technique is statistics. And obviously, that plays a huge role in establishing credibility, establishing expertise. And so statistics are another important factor in convincing your audience. The next technique is endorsements, and we talk about promotional testimonials. They're usually given by celebrities, people with a lot of charisma, people that you can recognize or that your audience can relate to, people that you think that your audience would want to aspire to be like. And so those endorsements really do wonders for a brand. We see it all the time in athletics. We see it all the time kind of with food and nutrition and health. And the last technique, obviously, is emotional appeals. It's used a lot in politics. And a lot of times when employing that technique, you use a lot of fear arousal strategies. But it's also not just about fear, right? If we can stir an emotion, be it of love, be it of compassion, be it of empathy, it's not just about scare tactics. We can also play on those emotions for our own, I don't want to say our own gain, but for our own benefit, if you will. So now, we've talked about all that persuasion can do for you, how to use it, why it's important. But now let's talk about the limits of persuasion. And so persuasion isn't an exact science because, as the book points out, if it wasn't an exact science, we'd all be driving the same type of car, we'd all be using the same electronics, and we'd all be wearing the same clothes. People don't always follow the same media channels, and sometimes our message gets lost in interpretation by others. It gets lost just in the replaying of that message through various channels. I mean, let's talk about a game of telephone, right? I'm sure we all played it in kindergarten, where somebody starts out with a message and you whisper it to the next person and you go on down the line, and next thing you know, once you get to the end of the line, you have a completely different message than what you started with. And that's kind of what happens to our messaging when it gets transmitted through so many channels, when it goes through radio, when it goes through television, when it goes through print media. And it even gets distorted in our own interpretation. So right there, we're talking about a lack of message penetration. Next, let's talk about competing messages. When we talk about competing messages, we talk about this idea of the hypodermic needle theory of communication, in which people receive information directly without intervening factors. And so what we've come to find out is that no message is received in a vacuum. Messages are filtered through our own social structure and belief system. And so because of that, each of us have a different interpretation of a message. So conflicting messages are not usually received well by people, especially those who have a strong belief system on current issues. So people usually stick to their beliefs, and contradicting messages usually aren't very well received. Now we talk about self-selection and self-perception. And as part of that, we talk about two major points: acceptance and perception. And in terms of acceptance, people mostly, again, accept messages that go along with their beliefs. And so, because of that, this idea that PR people and the media manipulate people or control people's thinking, right, is not necessarily true. We go back to that agenda setting theory from earlier in the chapter, where it's more acceptable or it's more believable to say that the media tells you topics or gives you topics to think about, not necessarily tells you what to think. And so because of all of these things, we can say that the media is actually more effective at reinforcing our existing attitudes than changing them. So when we talk about perception, perception is the context in which messages are interpreted. People will receive the same information differently depending on their own predispositions. It's funny, I was actually having a conversation with my dad, who happens to be a Republican. I'm a Democrat. And we're having this Trump conversation. And for the most part, I know he does it just to get on my nerves. But we started talking about this immigration issue. And I found a statistic that talked about the fact that some immigrants do pay taxes, illegal immigrants. And so while for me, I took that message to articulate that our immigrants immigrants are, for the most part, trying to do the right thing by paying taxes. My father took that message and interpreted it completely different and came up with a completely different conclusion. His conclusion being that these immigrants are using illegal Social Security numbers to file taxes, so from the gate they're wrong. So the idea is that perception can really affect our processing of persuasive messaging. So it's actually a limit to the effective transmission of persuasive messages, if you will. So our last part of the chapter talks about ethics and persuasion. And so we talk about public relations practitioners of being advocates of a client or an organization. There's an emphasis on persuasive communication to influence a particular public as a result. So the book gives us some guidelines. Most importantly are that as PR practitioners, we must conduct ourselves in an ethical manner. We must not advocate for something that we do not believe in ourselves, and we must not deceive the audience. And so that concludes chapter 9. I hope that from this chapter you guys have a better understanding of persuasive communication and how persuasive communication plays such a huge role in public relations, not just in terms of our everyday practices, but also in terms of how our messages are received by our publics. So thank you.